Hello, I'm O.S. Hawkins, and I want to welcome you to this film series on the Nehemiah Code. It's never too late for a new beginning. You know, I've noticed in life that at some time or another, that's what all of us are going to have to be interested in, and that is a new beginning. Whether we're rebuilding our self-confidence, rebuilding our home, rebuilding our church, rebuilding after an integrity crisis, whatever it may be, it's never too late for a new beginning. We're here at this beautiful Mission Espada in San Antonio, Texas. These walls have been here over 300 years, built by those Spanish explorers so long ago. But you know, there's something very interesting about them. They had to get started right in building these walls. They didn't just come out here and begin to put one stone upon another. First, they had to clear the ground, remove the debris, and build a solid foundation that would enable those stones to stand for these centuries. You know, getting started right is vitally important. Let's talk about that, because it's never too late for a new beginning. You know, rebuilding is a subject that touches everyone. There are people who are trying to rebuild their lives after divorce. Others are trying to rebuild their lives after perhaps the death of a spouse. Still others are rebuilding their lives after some setback. Churches are trying to revitalize and rebuild. Many of you have businesses that need a recharge, that need rebuilding themselves. You know, there's no one who's ever been a greater role model as a rebuilder than Nehemiah. You know, Nehemiah was an interesting person. He was not a priest. He was not a preacher. He was a layman, just like most of us watching this right now. He had a civil service job, actually, in the court of King Artaxerxes in Persia, and he had retirement benefits. He had all of those things stacked up with him, and yet he left all of it, took a risk to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild those broken walls. After the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom in 722 BC was taken away into Assyrian captivity and actually never returned. The southern kingdom was left in Judah with its capital in Jerusalem and its temple there. It was taken away into Babylonian captivity in 586 when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian legions surrounded the city of Jerusalem, eventually destroyed it, broke down its walls, burned its gates, took away its people captive, and only left a remnant there. They took away the brightest minds in Israel back to Babylon to train them in the way of the Babylonians so they could send them back to rule their conquered lands. You might remember Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego were some of those people. They came back, and later the Persians broke the Babylonian supremacy. And under Artaxerxes, a remnant of those captive Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and begin the rebuilding process under Ezra and others. They went back, and the task was so enormous, the debris was piled so high that after a few days of seeking to rebuild, they lost all hope and gave up. Years passed, and Nehemiah, who had a job in the court of the king, heard a report from Jerusalem that the walls were broken still, the gates were burned, and worse, the people were a reproach to God. And Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem to be the agent of rebuilding, to recruit those workers, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And miracle of miracles, he did it in 52 days. And the secret to the rebuilding process for Nehemiah and for you and for me is the ability to get started right. You know, in anything in life, that's where we have our most difficult time, and that is in starting right. I play golf. The most important shot on a par 4 is that tee shot. If you just dribble the ball off the tee or hook it into the woods, you have a difficult time ever getting on the green in 2. But if you make that first shot right down the fairway, where you're positioned to get on the green, you're well off. Most of us have tried to go on a diet, and the hardest part is just getting started. Or how about an exercise program? Many of us right now, I'm sure, need to be in an exercise program, and the basic reason we're not is that we just don't know how to get started. Well, if you want to rebuild your life, the most important principle is to get started right. And that's what Nehemiah shows us in the first chapter of his book, because he lays out some principles that will enable you and will enable me to get started right in our own personal rebuilding process. You know, the first step in getting started right is to make an honest evaluation of the situation. This is exactly what Nehemiah did in the first 3 verses of the book that bears his name in chapter 1. In fact, in verse 3, he says that the survivors who are left from captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. It was time for Nehemiah to face the facts, honestly. Those walls were still broken down after all those years. The gates were still burned to the city of Jerusalem and unhinged, meaning that they were so vulnerable to the enemy. But worse, Nehemiah says, left in that state, it was a total reproach to God. You know, I know folks who never get started right. I actually know some people who've met premature deaths because they wouldn't make an honest evaluation of their situation. They had pain, they had difficulty, they had heart pain, they ignored it, they didn't go to the doctor, and because they didn't make an honest evaluation of the situation, some of them met a premature death. I know folks in relationships that have broken relationships, and primarily because they wouldn't be honest with one another. Wouldn't make an honest evaluation of their circumstance and situation. In your own life, are there any walls that are broken? Any gates that are burned that have left you vulnerable to the enemy? Make an honest evaluation. The second most important thing in getting started right is to identify with the need. And this is exactly what Nehemiah did in the very next verse, verse 4, when he says, "So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." He sat down and he wept and he prayed and he fasted and he mourned for days. He identified with the need. He was thousands of miles away, and yet he identified with the need that was taking place in the city of Jerusalem. Tears, he wept over it as he identified with the need. Take a marriage, for example, that needs restoration. How vitally important is it to identify with the need in your own relationships? You know, when relationships are broken, primarily there are 2 parties. Primarily, there's an offending party whose offense brought about the broken relationship, and there's a party that was offended. 2 things have to happen. To restore relationships, we've got to identify with the need, like Nehemiah did. For example, on the part of the offending party, there must be a repentant heart. There's never going to be a restoration of relationship unless we identify with the need if we're the offending party and truly repent. And yet, there's also something for the offended party to do to identify with the need. There must be a receptive heart on the part of the offended party. You know, in my own life, dealing with people across the decades, I've found that most relationships that never got restored, it wasn't because the offending party was not repentant. It was because the offended party could not move themselves to identify with the need to be receptive of the one who had repented. Getting started right is vitally important. Make an honest evaluation, identify with the need, and then look what Nehemiah did in those next verses. Take personal responsibility. Nehemiah could have blamed all the problems on the past. He could have blamed it on King Zedekiah, the king of Judah, who did so many things that God came down in judgment upon them. He could have blamed it on Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king who came and totally didn't have to destroy the city of Jerusalem, but he did. He burned its gates and broke down its walls. He could have blamed it on Ezra and those others who came back and quit the job of rebuilding, but he didn't. He didn't play the blame game. He took personal responsibility. He identified with the need. Here we find Nehemiah doing that very thing in verses 5 through 11. He says in verse 6, "Both my father's house and I have sinned." He says we have sinned. He takes personal responsibility for the broken walls and burned gates of Jerusalem. You know, it only takes one person in the home, one person in the office, one person at school, one person at church, one person in your class to really make a difference, who takes personal responsibility for the issue and brings it up. This is what happened with Nehemiah. And he left a lasting legacy because he was that one man who took personal responsibility. And down in verse 11, Nehemiah brings out the fact that he feared the name of God. Later in his book, he says that he walked in the fear of God. That's so vitally important in getting started right, to live in this environment of the fear of God. Who can define what that is? How long has it been since you've heard a challenge to fear God? What does it mean to fear God? You know, I can show you better than tell you. I grew up in Fort Worth. I had a mom and dad who sacrificed so much for me. My dad, they were up in their 40s when I was born. They didn't think they could have children. I'm sure it wasn't a virgin birth, but it was a miraculous birth just the same, over 40 years of age when I was born. My dad worked for the city of Fort Worth, never made $10,000 a year in his life, retired way back in the 1960s. I never remember my mom buying a dress or blouse. Twice a year there'd come this big parcel from Stamford, Texas, out in West Texas. And the clothes my great aunt no longer wore, she gave to my mom and she wore. They sacrificed so much for me. If it was baseball season, my glove was just as good as anybody's on the team. If it was track season, my spikes were nice and shiny as anybody's on the team. They sacrificed so much for me. And you know, when I got into high school, I had a long desire to be a lawyer at those days and to go to college. Nobody in my family had ever graduated from college. And I knew my mom and dad weren't going to be able to afford it, so I quit playing ball after my sophomore year and got 2 jobs after school and on the weekends. And so I needed a car, not for social reasons. I needed one to go from school to work. And so we were able to get me a car. I mean, it was almost 10 years old. We paid $250 for that car. We put $50 down on it and financed the other $200 at the Poly State Bank. It was a 1956 Chevrolet. I wish I still had that 56 Chevrolet. But when I got that car, my dad set down some rules. I couldn't leave our house to get in that car. I didn't answer 4 questions. Where are you going? Who are you going with? What are you going to be doing? And when you're going to be home? It used to tick me off, especially when my buddies were with me who had no curfew, and I had to stop at my dad's chair, tell him where I was going, who I was going with, what I was going to do, when I was going to be home. One Friday night, we had taken our dates home, and we were down at Sutter's Barbecue, that old stomping grounds for our high school, and well, it had a big awning across the front, and you'd drive your car up under that awning. They had things in those days called car hops. They'd come out to your car and serve you out there. My buddies and I had parked our cars down at the end of that awning, and we were just sitting out there, standing out in front of our car, drinking a Coke that night, and all of a sudden, I saw my dad driving to Sutter's Barbecue. I thought, well, what's he doing here? He never eats out, and I've never seen him out past 9 o'clock except when we went over in the extra innings in a baseball game somewhere. And I looked at my watch, and I realized I knew why I was supposed to have been home 45 minutes ago. Well, fortunately, he drove in that other end of that awning, and he got out of his car, and he walked up to the front of his car, and he saw me across the way. Our eyes locked. You know how those F-16 fighter pilots lock in on the target right before they drop the bomb? He just stared at me. I said, well, what's he going to do? Is he going to come down here and embarrass me in front of him? And here's what he did. He just locked in on me across the way, and he went like this. Looked at his watch, and then he stared back at me. And then he got in his car, and he drove off. I beat him home, and I'll tell you why. I feared my daddy. Oh, not physically. I was 17 at the time. He was up in his 60s. I could have taken him down physically if I had to. I'll tell you what I feared. After all he sacrificed for me, after all he'd done for me, the thing I feared the most was I would do anything that would displease or dishonor my Lord after all he had done for me. You know, that's what Nehemiah is saying when he's talking about the fear of the Lord. It become a reproach to God, and the thing he feared the most, as he personally identified with the need and took personal responsibility, was that he would do anything that would dishonor or displease his Lord. And the final thing in getting started right, Nehemiah moved out of his comfort zone. Look at the last verse in the text. The last verse simply says, I was the cupbearer to the king. Most people just pass right over that verse and don't think anything about it. But look at it closely. I was the cupbearer to the king. There's so much behind that. He was the trusted confidant of the king of the most powerful nation in that region, Persia. That king never ate a morsel off his plate that Nehemiah didn't taste first. He was constantly at the king's side. He had a civil service job, flushed with all kinds of benefits and retirement. He was fixed for life. And he left it all to be the rebuilder of the broken walls. He moved out of his comfort zone. You know, that's one of the things that keeps so many of us from rebuilding, because we live in comfort zones. Some of us have comfort zones that are socioeconomic, and we never move out of them. Some of us have political comfort zones where only people we have relationships with are those in our own political persuasions. Some of us live in racial comfort zones and can't name a real friend outside of our own race. Listen, in rebuilding, moving out of your comfort zones, taking a risk is what's vitally important. Jesus told the whole parable of the talents to show you that He wanted you to be a risk-taking person. Many people spend their lives calculating why other people can do this and excusing why they can't. Not Nehemiah. He said, I was the cupbearer of the king, and he moved out of his comfort zone to be the rebuilder of the broken walls. Some of you need to rebuild your lives. First of all, you need to get started right. You know, I may be speaking to some people that have never even begun the great adventure for which you were created, to know Christ in the intimacy of Father and Son. You say, what's the way? How do I get started? Just like Nehemiah did. First, make an honest evaluation of the situation. The Bible says we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. We've all gone our way. That's our honest evaluation. Secondly, identify with the need. There's a God-shaped vacuum in every one of us. Oh, we try to fill it with all kinds of things, automobiles and even people, but it's only shaped for God. It's a God-shaped vacuum there. And the truth is, the something you think you need is really someone, and His sweet name is Jesus. Honestly evaluate your situation, identify with the need, take personal responsibility. Our sin, it's not some little vice we think we can laugh off. It's not something we can keep excusing by saying, well, everybody's doing it, or minimize it by saying it's not as bad as so-and-so. Our sin, my sin, your sin is so serious, it necessitated the cross. And then finally, move out of your comfort zone. By faith, put your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. And you'll get started right, because it's never too late for a new beginning.